So it's time to finally focus on Hughes, which is a good thing, because Hughes is great. So let's start off by going through these episodes and comparing them beat by beat. I love the way 2003's episode opens, with Hughes going to visit Mustang at some point after the Ishval War of Extermination. The best part of this scene is that we see Mustang at one of his lowest moments, and we see how Hughes is there for him and willing to help him however he can, even if that means giving Mustang some tough love. Also, because Mustang killed Winry's parents in this version, I think it's especially important for the writers to amplify Mustang's feelings here, so it makes sense that Hughes' feelings would be amplified as well. Meanwhile, Brotherhood begins with more action, as these soldiers get shot down one after another. As they're wounded or killed, Mustang says the power of one person does not amount to much. Of course, what we're being shown here is a reflection of what he's saying, and that makes his words and their meaning more powerful. Mustang is also the first major character that we physically see in this episode. This is important because while 2003 immediately makes it clear who this episode is going to be about, Brotherhood is being a bit more coy about that. Sure, Hughes is important in this scene, but this scene is also couched in Mustang's perspective instead of Hughes's. Opening with Hughes in 2003 makes the episode seem like it's more about Hughes, which makes it seem more likely that something bad is going to happen to him in this episode. Through Mustang's perspective, however, Brotherhood is trying to hide that possibility, while also showing how important Hughes is to Mustang. In fact, after this scene, Brotherhood cuts to Mustang sleeping, which implies that he has been reminiscing or dreaming about this. In contrast, 2003 cuts to Hughes sleeping, which implies the same thing but for Hughes instead. Here, Brotherhood is doing a pretty good job of mimicking the pacing and intent of the manga. Because while the manga does not include the scene between Mustang and Hughes in the same place as Brotherhood, it also doesn't place a large emphasis on Hughes. In fact, we just go from Ed and Al making up right to Hughes talking with them in Ed's hospital room. So this chapter really doesn't feel like it's about Hughes at all, and his death is made all the more shocking because of that fact. So even if I like this scene in 2003, I do have some mixed feelings about it. Using Hughes' death to surprise the audience is a good move, especially because in Mangahood, he feels like a character that hasn't reached his full potential yet. He feels like someone who should become more important as the plot goes on, not less. In 2003, perhaps they didn't feel the same need to surprise the audience. After all, Hughes has already gotten way more emphasis in this series, so even if they tried to misdirect us in this episode, I don't know if it would have worked as well as it does in Mangahood. Another way that 2003 places extra emphasis on Hughes is by having him meet with the Fuhrer alone. Of course, in Mangahood, a whole bunch of people meet with him, and the meeting itself is a lot less ominous. Sure, we get some sense that there's a threat here, but overall the Fuhrer seems like a cool dude, and really funny too, actually. Unfortunately, Brotherhood has tainted this moment with how they showed the Fuhrer in episode 1, but that doesn't change the fact that they're still doing a good job here. Sure, in 2003, the Fuhrer doesn't seem like a complete maniac or anything like that, but he definitely seems more evil than he does here in the manga and Brotherhood. Which, since 2003 is almost halfway through its plot, makes sense. It's probably time to really start placing emphasis on how the government itself has been infiltrated. Still, it is a difference, and I think it's worth pointing out. I definitely prefer a lot about Brotherhood's version of Bradley's meeting, though. It's more dynamic and humorous, and I think that injecting a bit of that into 2003 would have gone a long way in misdirecting the audience as far as Hughes' death is concerned. And a bit of misdirection here could have been a good thing. But as I said, I guess that isn't what they were going for, especially considering that this episode is called Words of Farewell in 2003, which is way more explicit than Separate Paths, which is used in Brotherhood. Of course, despite all these signals and differences, 2003 still has this scene in Ed's hospital room where Ed and some others discuss what's going on. One difference here is that Winry is involved for some reason. I'm not really sure why. It seems odd to include her in this conversation, even if I understand that it's probably just meant to show how close Ed and Al are with her, particularly after all that just happened. I just think it's a bit stupid on the adults' parts to let her get involved like this, which isn't a huge deal, but it is a change, and one that makes Hughes and Armstrong feel a bit more irresponsible, but also more understanding of Ed and Al. Another difference is that in 2003, Ed and Al say that they're done with looking for the Philosopher's Stone. This does not happen in Mangahood. Of course, Ed and Al are lying, and they're only really saying this because they don't want anyone else to get hurt. On one hand, this shows how much Ed and Al care for those around them, but on the other hand, it shows that Ed and Al still aren't willing to rely on others, and that they don't really understand that they will probably need other people's help on this journey. It's yet another example of how stubborn Ed is and how intent Ed and Al are on relying on themselves. And instead of planning to go to Rush Valley and then to their teacher, they are planning to go find Scar and ask him about how to make the Philosopher's Stone. Of course, the teacher still finds them, but that isn't quite the plan at this point. Also, in Mangahood, I love the scene where Hughes says goodbye to Winry, saying that she can consider their home as her own home. I mean, even if Hughes hasn't been built up or focused on all that much in Brotherhood, this is a great example of how likable he is in any version of the story, and why it's so sad to see him go. There's a real focus on him being a father figure to Winry, and on Gracia and their child being her mother and sister. I really wish that this scene was in 2003, but instead Hughes just says goodbye to them with the whole crowd there. I guess he's at least present when the brothers leave, though. But still, I really love this scene. Then in 2003, there's this whole section with Scar, where these horrible biker guys come up and start terrorizing the Ishvalans. The series utilizes a powerful juxtaposition to once again help us understand Scar's mindset and actions. After all, as this Ishvalan talks to Scar about how violence is wrong will only sow the seeds of resentment, the Ishvalans are being harmed by the bikers. So, of course, Scar gets involved and stops them. But what would have happened if he wasn't there? How can he be expected to just stand on the sidelines and watch it happen? Actually, it's not that I even simply understand Scar here. I actually agree with him in this moment. It's a reasonable decision. I mean, pacifism can only go so far until the pacifist needs to start fighting, die, or have somebody else fight for them. And it's not like Scar is just fighting for his own survival, which in and of itself would be pretty reasonable. He's also fighting for those around him, such as these kids that he's been with. Also in 2003, yet more focus is placed on Mustang and Hughes' relationship, when Mustang gets annoyed with him for not telling him that the brothers have been hospitalized. I really wish that this moment had been kept in Brotherhood, especially considering the absolutely amazing fight between Mustang and Envy later on in the series, and how much emotional weight some of these moments could have added to Hughes and Mustang's relationship. I really love the finality of Hughes' goodbye to his daughter too. There's a tenderness to him here that I absolutely adore, and I think that it speaks to how the creators of 2003 want us to feel. We know that Hughes is going to die. We know that it's coming. But we hope it's not, because we care about this guy and he's been an integral figure so far. So instead of trying to blindside the audience like Mangahood, the show gradually feeds the audience more and more hints that this is about to happen. Even if I still wish that there was more of an element of surprise to Hughes' death here, I respect this decision, and I think that it was really well realized. Well, almost. Because in this episode, something goes really wrong. As you probably remember, in Mangahood, Hughes' discovery is an incredibly important moment. After all, he's just discovered what is going to be a big twist in the manga, and a twist that unfortunately has sort of been foreshadowed in Brotherhood, which was a silly move, but either way, his discovery makes complete sense. After all, the villains can't hide that they're making a giant transmutation circle. They can certainly try, but it's right there. And mass killings are going to be pretty difficult to keep secret. In other words, the thing Hughes discovers is something that is inherently going to be in plain sight, but that would also be hard to see. It's a moment of incredible intelligence on Hughes' part, even if we don't get to know what he's discovered at this moment. And his reaction makes sense. He's going to go tell Mustang by phoning him from inside the government building, but then he realizes that the government is most likely involved in all this, and runs outside to try and get a hold of him some other way. And knowing that he'd be willing to put his life in danger, that he'd be willing to leave his wife and child behind so that this information can be known by the right people. That's powerful stuff, and a great way to convince the audience that this discovery is very important without directly showing the audience what it is that Hughes discovered. So, in this way, I like how Mangahood handles Hughes' death. The events leading up to it seem to make complete sense, which allows us to not be distracted or confused while we're supposed to be shocked and saddened by Hughes' death. I only mention this because 2003 makes a huge mistake here. Because the thing he discovers in this show is silly. See, in 2003, Hughes finds out that an officer named Juliet Douglas is the one who shot a kid and started the whole Ishval War of extermination. As Hughes only just recently met Juliet Douglas, he makes the connection pretty quickly. The secretary must, in some way, be related to this person. Or, at the least, it's a hunch that Hughes has. And one that must be pretty serious considering that he sends Cheska home and tells her to never come back. There's already a huge problem here. In Mangahood, the secret the homunculi and father are trying to keep is a secret that can only be so well hidden, so Hughes finding it feels natural. In 2003, the secret the homunculi and Dante are trying to keep is... I don't really know. Why would they do this? Why not name Sloth something other than Juliet Douglas? Why would you even invite that comparison or connection? Just choose another name. Using Juliet Douglas is incredibly stupid. And I know that later on in this series they try to justify this, but I don't really understand the justification. Why do they really need to sneak Sloth into the registry? It's all just very arbitrary. But let's just say that the show is fine so far. Let's say that this is somehow part of Dante's plan or part of some other villain's plan that we don't know about yet at this point in the series, and we're just going to roll with it and trust the show. Maybe the homunculi just made a mistake here, and that's possible. They could make mistakes. The villains don't have to be perfect. Maybe it's just some way of showing Bradley's pride. After all, in this series, Bradley is pride. Sure, I'm not going to buy that, but I guess somebody could make that argument even if I still don't like it. Regardless of that, though, the undeniably unbelievable thing is that Hughes still goes to meet with Juliet Douglas, and without telling anybody about his suspicions. There's absolutely no reason to do this. Why go and confirm this right now? Why go and confirm this alone? It's an incredibly and uncharacteristically moronic move on Hughes' part. We've seen that Hughes is an intelligent person. Why would he do this? There's no reason that I can think of, and as I rewatched this episode, that was all I could think about. Why? These circumstances make Hughes' death feel exceptionally contrived in 2003, which is a real shame because the build-up to it otherwise has been so much better. Simply put, Hughes is a better and more important character in 2003 than he is in Mangahood, and he's definitely more important to Ed. And I still prefer the way that this is directed in 2003, but I wasn't able to appreciate it, because I was too distracted by how illogical this whole situation is. And that's a horrible, horrible thing to have happen, especially at a moment like this. But does that mean that I was in no way moved by his death in 2003? Of course not. I was more moved by it in 2003 than I was in Mangahood, that much is still for certain. But it could have been so much better if it wasn't so contrived, and that's honestly a real shame. As far as the aftermath of this event is concerned, I don't really have that much to say as far as comparison goes, because I think that both versions do a fantastic job with this moment, when Hughes is getting buried. Both are wonderfully directed and incredibly sad and have background music that perfectly suits the subject matter. I do love how they have Bradley shaking here in Mangahood though, the way it gets us to sympathize with and feel for Bradley, and then how it turns this around later by revealing that he was shaking out of rage. It's brilliant. I do appreciate, however, how 2003 takes a bit more time with the burial, allowing the atmosphere to solidify itself and linger. But again, both do great jobs of this. And then there's one of the story's most iconic moments. Mustang standing at Hughes' grave, crying. In 2003, I felt the most connected to it because of the greater amount of time we spent with Hughes. Still, if we're just talking about this moment itself, all three versions of the story once again do a great job. I do really appreciate this added moment in 2003 though, where Hawkeye explains Hughes' actions to Mustang and how Hughes took it upon himself to deal with the boys because Mustang tends to lose his cool when they get involved. 2003 also gets some extra points because it uses the instrumental version of Brothers, which is, first of all, just a great piece of music, and second, helps us equate, or at least encourages us to compare, Mustang's and Hughes' relationship to Ed and Al's. In other words, it encourages us to view Mustang's and Hughes' relationship not as that of a superior officer to a subordinate, but to think of them as two brothers who were really close friends, and who were willing to do so much for each other. This is expert use of the soundtrack. In 2003, the events are also reshuffled so that Ed, Al, and Winry being on the train closes off this episode, and I think that's a really good idea. It puts some emphasis on the fact that Ed, Al, and Winry are never going to see Hughes again, and they don't even know that yet. Sure, that idea is still relevant in all versions of this scene, but it's especially powerful here. And 2003 even includes this moment where Hughes' ghost waves to Ed. It really is going all in on the melodrama and committing. I know that some people feel that this went a bit too far, and I totally understand that. And I also know some people who feel that it added more emotion to the whole situation, and I also understand that. But this moment didn't really bother me, and it didn't really make me feel any more emotional. I was just very neutral about it. Well, with that, we've reached the end of this section. Now let's talk about Rush Valley and discuss Mustang's actions following Hughes' death.